Welcome all. It was good to see so many people, not over Zoom, but actually in person. So I'm glad that we have been able to lift the restrictions, that numbers look good, to allow us to actually do this. The unfortunate event that is bringing us together is the war that is happening in the Ukraine, and I wish that we didn't really have to do this. So I was preparing for this last week, or not for this, I was preparing for a brief discussion on the Ukraine last week, and then I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to use the resources we have on campus to come together and actually present what we know about the Ukraine, to tell others what's going on. So we're going to have a little discussion today. We have Stephanie Merkel, and we have Jim Franklin and myself here. But before we go into discussion, in which we're going to each present for about 10 minutes, and we're going to open the floor for questions. So before that, I would like to introduce President Rock Jones, who is going to make a few brief remarks. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Goran, and let me add my welcome. It is just great to actually be able to get together and to see faces and to be together in ways that we have not been able to be together now for nearly 2 years. It was 2 years ago this week that the pandemic began to arrive in our backyard. But I want to thank you especially for coming together at this time on this topic. I want to thank the members of our faculty who have taken time from their busy schedules to prepare to share with us. And I want to thank all of those of you who, and I see some of you here, who were at the vigil last night with about 75 of our students, standing in solidarity with and support of the people of Ukraine, others who are in that country, and people who in other parts of the world are the victims of violence and oppression. The events that have taken place in the past week are atrocious. We certainly condemn the actions of Vladimir Putin, and we stand with the people of Ukraine. When I think about what we can do from here, one of the things we can always do is to seek to better understand, which is what a liberal arts education does every day, so that our students are prepared when they graduate to provide leadership in hoping to make the world a safer, more secure, more peaceful, and more just place. It's been suggested that we begin with a moment of silence as we reflect with one another on the situation and the people of Ukraine. So I invite you to join me in a moment of silence. Thank you.
First is going to be Stephanie Merkel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Stephanie Merkel, and I'm a professor in the Department of English. I did my doctoral work in Slavic studies. I have a specialty in Russian literature, especially poetry. And before that, I earned my BA in Soviet studies. That was a long time ago. At the end of last semester, I introduced the Ukrainian-American poet Ilia Kaminsky from this very stage. It was just 3 months ago. And if you were there, you remember that he read from his new book, Deaf Republic, which is a series of narrative poems about a fictional village called Vasinka, which is under occupation by enemy invaders. You may remember his thundering reading of the poem, "We lived happily during the war, forgive us." Last week, Russian troops reinvaded the Ukraine. Kaminsky's poems about the fictional village Vasinka are steeped in a very real history of invasions of Ukraine and occupations by foreign forces during World War II, and more recently in 2014 with the Russian invasion of southern Russia and annexation of Crimea. So really what happened last week is a re-invasion. Last week, Ilia Kaminsky gave an interview to the Princetonian in which he urged all of us to pay attention, not just to the violence that's happening, to the pictures of burning buildings and injured civilians, but to pay attention to the entire picture of the beautiful country of Ukraine, the very beautiful and open country of Ukraine, which is now embroiled in violence. Kaminsky, and I'm quoting, said, "Violence is the language power wants us to see, and you, as a human, want to see many different kinds and registers of language expressed." Kaminsky continues, "Empire wants to dull the senses, but the purpose of a poet is to wake them up." I thought today the most appropriate way for me to wake us all up at the beginning of our discussion is by reading two poems by Ukrainian poets. These poems appeared in a collection called Words for War, New Poems from Ukraine, which was published in 2017 after the first invasion by Russia. The first poet's name is Halina Kruk. She was born in 1974. She lives in Lviv, in the western part of Ukraine. She writes in Ukrainian. The translation I'm going to read is by Sibyllin Forrester. Someone stands between you and death, but who knows how much more my heart can stand. Where you are, it's so important someone prays for you, even with their own words, even if they don't clasp their hands and kneel. Plucking the stems off strawberries from the garden, I recall how I scolded you when you were small for squashing the berries before they ripened. My heart whispers, "Death, he hasn't ripened yet. He's still green. Nothing in his life has been sweeter than unwashed strawberries. I beg you, oh God, don't place him at the front. Please don't rain rockets down on him. Oh God, I don't even know what a rocket looks like. My son, I can't picture the war even to myself." Of course, now Halina Kruk has a very good idea of what war looks like. She is today sheltering in her basement in Lviv. The second poem I would like to read to you all is a poem by Anastasia Avanasi. Avanasi writes in Russian, and I want to take 1 second to comment on this. You'll note that the two Ukrainian poets that I'm reading from write in different languages. The Ukraine is a multinational union of many different peoples. The Ukrainian language and the Russian language exist side by side in the society. At a university like ours, it would be very normal to have lecturers lecturing in Ukrainian, if that's their strongest language, or to be lecturing in Russian, if that is their strongest language. Ukrainian and Russian are distinct languages. They are different languages, but they exist peacefully side by side. She says we don't have the right kind of basement in our building. I'd have to leave. No one can hide in there. We couldn't leave for a whole week straight. Men elbowed us out. We were weaker. There was no room for us. In the past, we thought about nice furniture, home improvements and such. Now we think our basement doesn't work. It won't protect us. it'll collapse on us. It's worse than sitting outside. We dragged our mattresses and pillows onto the floor so that we could fall down as soon as it all starts. We fell down and lay there. My husband stayed behind. Someone had to stay home. Otherwise, there'd be no home to come back to. There may be nowhere to go back to anyway. He watches the apartment so no one moves in and takes our things. He calls once a week from some high-rise where he magically gets cell reception. He says a few words and hangs up. I am alive. Call back next Saturday. When a four-wheeler with a mortar passed down the street, we didn't ask, who are you? Whose side are you on? We fell down to the floor and lay there. On our way to the market, the bullets whistled over our heads. We arrived here with a single bag. There wasn't enough room for people, let alone things. She speaks as if the August air enters the room in the yard. In the yard, my coworkers are gathering overripe plums. Last year, those were perfect. This time around, we missed our harvest. Now it's too late. I listen, and I don't know if heaven and hell really exist. They must be separated by a journey in a minivan packed full of people, where plums ripen in silence, where people fall to the ground, and we're experiencing these moments after death. I think poetry has a very important role to play in our thinking and experiencing and processing of political events, because poetry gets past the polarities that power speaks to and helps us to understand those nuances in between and the experiences of real human beings. My colleagues will, I think, now talk a little bit more about the economic implications, political history, and so forth.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was very powerful. Jim?
Okay, yeah, it's great to be here. Start by saying it's sad that our colleague Sean Kay is not here. He's a leading world expert in European security and NATO, so it's so sad that he can't be here. I'll do what I can in his place. Russia and Ukraine are not my expertise, but I do research on protest movements, which includes a lot of Ukraine and other countries in the region. I'll just start by saying, talking about some of the primary reasons that have been offered for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so one reason that Vladimir Putin has talked a lot about and others have talked about is NATO expansion as a threat to Russia. Another reason offered is Putin wanting to expand, rebuild kind of a greater Russia, rebuild the Russian Empire, you might say. And others point to Putin's own vulnerability, his own fears about his own standing, his declining popularity and fear of color revolutions, popular protests which have removed dictators in surrounding countries. So first on NATO expansion, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded to strengthen European security and to halt Soviet expansion. After the fall of communism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, many countries, former communist countries, applied for membership in NATO, and NATO did expand into many of these countries, including the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So these are, they were part of the Soviet Union and they joined NATO. And many people in Russia, not just Vladimir Putin, but many others, saw this as threatening, saying, why, now that the Soviet Union is gone, why are you expanding NATO? It made it seem that Russia was seen still as an enemy, and some people have argued, even people that don't really sympathize with Vladimir Putin anyway, have argued that, maybe we missed an opportunity. Maybe Russia should have been seen more as a friend and not treated as a potential enemy. Although others who defend NATO expansion would say that Russia was actually a partner. There was a partnership in peace program where Russia was invited to kind of be an observer in NATO operations. And some look back now and say, well, see, we were right to expand NATO. Look at what Putin did in Ukraine. I'm sure people in the Baltic republics are relieved to be members of NATO. So there's different ways you can look at that issue. On the perspective of rebuilding the Russian Empire and fear of color revolutions, Putin has wanted to have pro-Russian or at least neutral leadership throughout the former Soviet republics, and Ukraine is one of those. And look at some events leading up to this invasion. In 2003, the Republic of Georgia, which is another former Soviet republic on the borders of Russia, that became independent, they had what was called the Rose Revolution in 2003, following fraudulent elections. The president there, who harkened back to the Soviet times, was seen as corrupt. Protests broke out and forced him from office. And following that, Russia recognized certain separatist regions within the Republic of Georgia. They stationed troops there. There was a small war that was fought there. I think you'll see this is very similar to events later on in Ukraine. Ukraine itself had a revolution the following year, 2004, the Orange Revolution. Again, there was charge where there was a rigged election. There was a more pro-Western candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, and a more Russian-backed candidate, Viktor Yanukovych. The pro-Western candidate was poisoned, but he survived, but it did scar his face. And the poisoning of opposition leaders is something we've seen happen in Russia. The results were announced that Yanukovych won, but there was a lot of evidence of rigged election, and protests broke out demanding a revote, and a revote did occur, and the more pro-Western candidate Yushchenko won, and so that was called the Orange Revolution. And so I think for Putin it was a sign, that Ukraine might be leaving his grasp, or it might be edging more towards Western Europe and away from Russia. But Yanukovych came back and won the next election, and that was actually generally seen as free and fair. But protests broke out again when Yanukovych started tying Ukraine more to Russia, and the main opposition leader, Yulia Tymoshenko, was arrested and tried and sentenced to prison. But the protests did not lead to any major political changes, but more protests broke out again in Ukraine. This was 2013, where President Yanukovych, he rejected a plan to tie Ukraine more to the European Union. And there were major protests broke out in the central square of Kiev called Maidan. And the protests eventually basically took over the city, and Yanukovych had to flee. And then he was voted out of office by the parliament. And that's called the Revolution of Dignity or the Euromaidan Revolution. There's different names for it. Vladimir Putin, of course, was not happy about this. He described this as a coup. And shortly after this revolution, Russia sent troops in and they annexed Crimea, which is a part of Ukraine that's traditionally been a more pro-Russian province of Ukraine. And also there were separatist groups within eastern parts of Ukraine, and Russia gave them military support. So that was in 2014. So Ukraine and Russia have pretty much been at a small-scale war since 2014. In the meantime, there have been since the Maidan revolution, there have been a couple of elections that both elected more pro-Western leaders. The most recent one, 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president. It's interesting, he actually was an actor beforehand, and he played, I think it was a TV show where he played the role of I think it was a history teacher who is vaulted into the presidency. That was his character in the TV show, and then he turned that into real life and ran for president and was elected overwhelmingly. And by the way, I think people had their doubts about Zelensky as a president, especially facing this huge crisis, but he's been a pretty inspiring president, very brave, inspiring president since the invasion. So the fighting has been going on. There was also massive protests in Belarus in 2020 against the President Alexander Lukashenko. He was able to hold on, but he only did so through harsh repression and with Russian support. And so with the invasion itself, Russia, I'm sure you all noticed, Russia slowly massing troops on the border with Ukraine, demanding that Ukraine pledge not to join NATO and demanding that NATO put in writing that Ukraine could never join NATO. Putin accused the Ukrainian government of genocide against Russian speakers, there's no evidence of that. He accused them of being Nazis, even though that the president is actually Jewish. And then, of course, Russia invaded on February 24th. Now, what is the goal? It seems that Putin wants to take the capital, install a puppet president. Some are thinking maybe even Yanukovych, the same president, he might end up being put back on as a sort of puppet president, a pro-Russian puppet president. They'll create some type of a new Ukraine that will be lean more towards Russia. Now, can Russia take all of Ukraine? That seems very difficult to do. The Russian campaign so far has gone a lot worse than Russia expected. The Ukrainians have been fighting back fiercely, valiantly. The initial attacks have been repulsed. It took them, I think they've finally taken a major city, but it's taken a long time. There's all kinds of evidence of low morale, lack of logistics, of food and weapons and fuel for the Russian military columns, some Russian troops surrendering en masse. But on the other hand, Russia still has a lot of military might, and they seem to be not able to get a quick invasion where they can quickly take over the capital city. They seem to be settling down into bombing the cities, which is something they practiced in Syria when they helped the Syrian government. They bombed civilians in Aleppo and destroyed hospitals. They seem to be doing more and more of that now in Ukraine. And so the Western response, I'm sure Professor Skosples will talk a lot about the sanctions. So the West has responded with strong sanctions. The West has become more united. I think in that sense, this is not what Putin had in mind. NATO is probably more united than it's been, and Western countries in general are more united than they've been in a long time. As far as what is the end game, it's hard to see, even if the Russian forces are able to occupy certain parts of Ukraine and install a puppet president, how can they maintain that puppet in power? It would require a lot of Russian troops. And it's pretty clear now that Ukrainians are going to resist, and it will be a very costly occupation. There's already major losses among Russian troops. So how long can that last? There's a possibility maybe of some type of negotiated peace. Maybe, that might be, part of the strategy here with bombing cities. Maybe that'll force the Ukrainians to sign some peace deal where they'll recognize certain parts of Ukraine being annexed by Russia or some other separatist region in return for peace. And then another question is Putin himself. This is risky for him. As I mentioned, his support has been declining. We've seen major protests break out within Russia. The sanctions are going to hit Russian people, but also the wealthy oligarchs harshly, and the Russian army. I think that's something to watch. As I said, there's already poor morale among troops. Will the Russian army, will they eventually resist or push back against fighting this war, this costly war in Ukraine? So I'll stop there and let Goran go on.
Thank you, Jim. All right, so I'm a professor of economics, so I'll try to give you an economic perspective. Some would argue that everything is economic in nature, perhaps this war as well. Ukraine is a large country. It's actually the largest country in Europe. It's larger than Germany, larger than France, larger than Poland, other big major countries. But it's minuscule compared to Russia. I mean, Russia is vastly larger. If you look on the map up above me, Ukraine is half of that orange part. The other part is Belarus. And all of the red is Russia. I mean, Russia is almost twice the size of the United States. And Ukraine is about the size of Texas, just to give you a perspective on the size. In terms of population, Russia has about 144 million people. That big, vast area in Siberia, polar bears mostly. Not many people in that region, but lots of oil, lots of natural gas. Ukraine has about just over 40 million people, so it's not that little. We are seeing some refugees coming across the borders of Hungary, Romania, Slovakia. Right now, some estimates are close to 1 million, but Ukraine has 40 million people, so 1 million is really nothing yet. If this keeps going and if the cities start being bombarded, we're going to see a huge impact on European economies. All right, so some politicians, some commentaries have been describing Russia as the world's gas station. I would say, okay, it's a gas station perhaps with a gun shop attached to it, because those are the main exports Russia does: natural gas and oil. By far the biggest exports, some metals. They're like palladium, for instance, which is important in microchips and in some of the renewable batteries. They're the biggest exporter of that. And then you have arms. So the Western world has put sanctions on Russia. And sanctions are primarily on exports of arms, and some smaller items. But really, exports touching the energy sector have not been implemented yet. Sanctions have been designed not to touch that. You might ask, well, why is that the case? Well, yes, would that hurt Russia? Absolutely. But would that hurt the rest of the world? Yes. So the question is, how much is the world willing to go? I was looking at this. It started last Wednesday night. I was up, 2 o'clock in the morning, and I started seeing the first reports of the attack, and then I stayed up all night just watching what was going on. I just couldn't go to bed. And Dow Jones was down about 900 points, futures, so markets were expecting to be tank. Asian markets, likewise, they tanked already. So by the time the morning rolled around, Asian markets closed in deep red. U.S. markets opened very badly. Now, as the day progressed, that was the first day, Thursday, Russia bombarded Ukraine heavily. They progressed that first day pretty well into the country. There was no resistance met at the border. I mean, if you saw tanks rolling in, there was absolutely nothing at the border. I mean, I was shocked. Why wouldn't you as a country protect yourself at the border? And I guess the rest of the world saw that as it's going to end up quickly. It's going to end quickly. Yep, too bad for Ukraine, but at least markets are going to be settled. So guess what happened? Dow Jones actually closed in the green on Thursday. On Friday, Dow Jones actually went up. Oil went down on Thursday, both Thursday and Friday. Markets settled. Everybody expected this to be quick end. I was talking to some of my colleagues. Honestly, I expected Ukraine not to be around by Monday. I mean, how things were developing that Thursday and Friday. But it seems that the strategy was to pull back into the cities. You can't fight artillery in the open field. Ukraine couldn't do it, so they pulled back into the cities, and that's where now we are starting to see some resistance. And the president, Jim described President Zelensky as a comedian. Joke's on us, right? He's not really, he turned out to be a great leader, and I think he's great support, morale for the troops. I bet you that there's a heavy price on his head, because if he fell down, if he escaped right away, the possibility of the Ukrainian government or military laying the weapons down would have been much greater than that. All right, so over the weekend, Europe saw, okay, look, and the U.S., sanctions that we kind of put on, Germans closed Nord Stream 2. Well, that wasn't operational in the first place, so effectively, that meant almost nothing. There was some discussions on closing the SWIFT, which is the system of bank communication, how banks transfer money. They said, maybe not yet. We're not going to do that. And then over the weekend, as the Ukraine started fighting back and Russia stalled, I would say Zelensky was super courageous for not leaving the city, because once the city is surrounded, he won't be able to escape. And I think Europe and U.S. were put to shame for not really imposing some more sanctions, and so that's why we're seeing some more sanctions being put over the weekend. So now, on Monday, markets open, and that's when we are seeing oil started to rise in terms of price, and more meaningful sanctions are being put. Although I would say it's still not on the energy market, at least not officially. Some of the stories that I've been hearing is some sort of soft sanctions on energy. So who buys oil? Russian oil would be refineries. Well, refineries around the world are really not willing to buy Russian oil. So there are tankers roaming around full of Russian oil, and nobody wants to buy it. Traders don't want to buy it. Yesterday on the market, Russian oil was going at a $20 discount, meaning if it's $115 for a barrel of Brent, which is the standard number that we use for price of oil in the world, Russian oil was $20 cheaper, and nobody wanted to buy it. So refineries didn't want to deal with it. It was too much trouble. Nobody knows what's going to happen with sanctions. Oil refineries don't want to buy Russian oil, and then a few months after being hit by huge fines. So nobody really, it seems that these soft sanctions might have a pretty decent impact. The Russian banking system seems to be running into liquidity issues, where people are now withdrawing their money. Ruble has been losing a lot of its value, so people who have their funds in banks, they want their money out, because you don't want to hold your money in the bank and it's going to lose a tremendous amount of value. Well, if everybody comes and withdraws their money at the same time, that will cause the banking system to collapse. So they have frozen the amounts that people can take out of bank accounts. There seems to be a little bit of a panic setting in. Now, how long that's going to last, whether they're going to be able to calm it down, I really don't know. So when you think about Russia, Russia's main grip on Europe is oil and gas. And this is a network of pipelines that you can see. The red one over there, that's the Nord Stream one, that's the biggest one, the newest one that's being built, that's not really in use yet. But look at the network of these pipelines. There are lots of them already around. It's not that this is the only one. So there's lots of oil coming into Europe from Russia, and Europe depends on oil from Russia. Europe, and especially natural gas. It's very hard to get it in short time from somewhere else. German industry, they import about 40% comes from Russia. So it's going to be hard to really stop that immediately. Now, when I said nobody wants to buy Russian oil, Well, that's not necessarily true. You know, in the long run, I could see that China might buy some of that Russian oil. So you might see a little bit of a shift. Now Europe is not buying Chinese or Russian oil. Europe is shifting more towards the Middle Eastern oil. Well, you're going to see maybe Chinese shifting to Russian oil, so it's kind of repositioning who buys from who, but that's going to take a while. I teach principles of economics, and we teach students that things in the short run don't really could be disrupted for a while. So maybe that's why we're seeing price of oil high in the U.S. and price of gas high in the U.S. From last week to this week, I think it went from $95 to $110 for a barrel of oil. Price of gas from about, $3.10 I saw last week on Central and Speedway. Now it's $3.69, $3.70. So it's about 20% increase for both. Could we see a rise even more to $4? I would probably say there's more likely than not that we might have that going on. So are we going to see some inflation perhaps in the U.S.? Yeah, I can see that happen very reasonably. So how do we solve this? I mean, economically, right? So we are willing to impose sanctions as long as it doesn't hurt us. Well, now maybe we are willing to accept some pain. And some price of oil, people are saying, okay, maybe we're going to be able to accept a little bit of a rise in the price of oil. There's been a call to increase production of oil. That there's big discussion, well, should we continue drilling? That there has been a tremendous fall in terms of how much we, the United States, produce. We actually produce the most in the world in terms of oil. But guess what? Not only do we produce the most, we use even more than that, because we just like using oil for lots of different things. We like driving around and using oil for different kinds of things. I mean, if you look at this, in terms of production of oil, blue line is the production of oil, red line is the price of oil. So when you say that we had when you look at a drop in production of oil, and drop in production of oil, especially the last one due to the pandemic, a lot of it was due to a decrease in demand. People said, well, people are criticizing the president, well, there's been lots of restrictions on drilling and all that. Well, that's true, but I would say a bigger impact has been the price. I mean, when you look at price in 2014, price of oil has started dropping, and it came down to about $30 a barrel, mid-30s. U.S. shale producers were producing lots of oil in Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, a lot of oil production. The Middle East didn't like that, so they increased the production of oil to drop the price and really clean out all the shale producers in the United States. And they have successfully done that. It's very expensive to take gas or oil out of shale. It's much cheaper if you're in Saudi Arabia to stick a pipe in the ground and oil comes out. So they can sustain much lower prices. So people are criticizing our government for not really producing a lot, but it's not really that government gives directives to firms to produce. It's mostly the price that dictates. So can we see that there's going to be more production? Yeah, I mean, there's estimates that actually our production is going to top what it was in 2019 when it was the highest amount. Do we already see more rigs in? Yeah, there's been a number of rigs that are drilling has already been on the rise. All right, so price $100 a barrel or more, yeah, we're going to see some of the pumps, some of the shale pumps restarting here, even in the Midwest. Right now, the biggest basin is the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico. They're producing more than they have ever in history. So saying that we don't really produce, it's not necessarily true, but we also use a lot. That seems to be a big issue. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and we would like to have some questions from you. I mean, we wanted to leave enough time because we believe that questions from you might be more appropriate than us just lecturing. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And where do we have a microphone? Lane? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Trying to follow what's been happening in Ukraine, gets successively more complex as we find out more about the geography, the history, and I think that we would be able to better understand what's at stake and who the players are if we knew more about that. We hear about something called the Donbass, and then we find out, well, no, it's different parts of it with two different seceding, self-defined areas. We don't know. Are they run by Russians now? And what about the closer you get to the south, where you have Crimea and so forth? It seems to get very complex. And I just found out recently that Belarus is a player in this. Where did they come from? What's their history?
Dennis, I'd be glad to respond to that. I'm a Slavicist. I specialize in the cultures of the East Slavs. The East Slavs consist of the Belarusians, the Russians, and the Ukrainians. And of course, my greatest specialty is in Russian language and literature and culture. But the East Slavs were really united as one people back in the 9th century. And of course, their cultural center was Kiev. Now, if you watched any of Vladimir Putin's very strange broadcast last week, he gave an hour-long speech, then you heard him say things about the Ukrainian state being a fiction, or Ukrainian language, or Ukrainians and Russians being one people. I have to say, this is a medieval fantasy. When we go back to, the 9th century or the 10th century, Kiev and that's a long time ago. And of course, there were developments. One of the most significant events was the Mongol invasion of 1237, when Kiev, which was a major trading center of Europe, was destroyed. 80% of its population was destroyed, absolutely, by the Mongols in 1237. And this sort of put that area in a deep freeze for about 200 years. To make a long story short, during that time, you have the rise of a little small place called Muscovy, right? And so that's where you have the branching off of the Ukrainian and Russian cultural centers, language, and so forth. You can't really talk about a Russian empire until the 18th century. Before then, it's Muscovy. And I don't want to honor Putin's falsehoods by trying to give a mini lecture about what the difference is linguistically between Ukrainian and Russian, but I can say simply they are different languages. Russian developed with a more Finnic influence. In fact, the word for Moscow is Finnic. It means a marshy bog. And Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian language was influenced more by the West. So there is a real distinction. And we're seeing right now the Ukrainians are fighting so vigorously against this invasion because, of course, Belarus is
its own history, and we don't know.
It has its own language, its own history, but it's politically allied with Putin's Russia right now. Yeah, but again, a distinct language. I am fluent in Russian, but I do not speak Ukrainian. Russians in Russia today don't speak Ukrainian unless they've learned it.
Thanks, Bob. You're going to help? There's a question in the back.
Thank you. As we see potentially markets getting hit and just sort of an economic downturn in general, but also at the same time, global inflation likely to pick up, how do you see central banks across the world handling this situation?
Well, Jerome Powell just said yesterday that they're still on track to increase the interest rates to cool off inflation. It'll all depend how long this lasts. I mean, this could last for a long time, and then we could have some drastic measures such as pushing the economy into a recession, basically engineering a recession to keep inflation lower or lower it down. It could be that energy prices calm down a little bit in the, not in the immediate time, but in the medium term, and then their pressure really relieves for inflation. I mean, most of the inflation pressures are from energy and lots of our supply chain issues. There's still some disruptions in the labor markets, and labor markets, just numbers yesterday showed up good additions of people to the labor market. So maybe there's going to be a lower pressure on wages, so wages not to rise as fast as they have been rising. Productivity numbers have come out good today at actually 6.9%, which is an amazing number. Now, usually productivity numbers are around 2% a year. That would be a good year. It's hard to predict. They themselves say we're going to play it by ear. Central banks were planning on increasing interest rates, but now that little twist that happened, I bet you they're going to be more open to saying, well, let's see, maybe not increase as much as we thought, maybe just a little bit. That's the best I have right now.
So, has this war in the Ukraine emboldened any maybe former Soviet bloc countries or anything like that? Because I was just thinking in terms of China, how China hasn't really entertained this attack very much. Has this maybe emboldened Russian sympathizers in any way?
Embolden Russian sympathizers? Do you have any particular place in mind where you're?
I was just thinking in terms of the former Soviet bloc countries. So, for instance, Belarus, maybe that would sort of strengthen the opposition, maybe encouraging a further crackdown on public protests.
Yeah, well, Belarus, it has allowed Russia to launch this invasion from their territory. Like I mentioned before, that there were major protests in Belarus after another rigged election by Lukashenko, and a lot of observers think that he pretty much had to go running to Putin to help shore up his regime, and so I think that's why Russian troops have been allowed to use Belarus as a launching point. And one question, would Belarus join the war? And there's been kind of signals back and forth where they might personally get involved in the war. But I think that's dangerous for Lukashenko. If he gets involved and his troops start suffering major losses like Russian troops, that could feed the opposition even more. And it's also interesting to watch Kazakhstan is another former Soviet republic. Kazakhstan had protests earlier this semester, which we read about in a class that Blake is in, and they asked for Russian troops to help with the protests, but then Kazakhstan recently put out a statement they were not going to assist in this war in Ukraine, and so that might be a case where maybe Putin was calling for them to contribute some troops for the war effort, and they refused. So that does show that they're not all getting in line with Russia.
There's a question over there.
Gordon, he's been raising his hand. Yes, sir.
Since Russia's recession in the late 90s, it's accumulated quite a lot of foreign reserves. And do you think that Russia's supply of foreign reserves will enable it to endure sanctions for longer, or at least stop them from hitting ordinary Russians? And I mean, either the sanctions we have now or more serious sanctions on oil and gas that we could have in the future.
Well, no matter how big your reserves are, if you are not replenishing them, eventually you will run out of them. So it'll all depend how much they can export of oil and gas. Right now, they're exporting about 5 million barrels a day. Just put a calculation times 100, given about $100 a barrel. Right? That's all money that's coming in. Now, a lot of their reserves have been stashed in different central banks, and different central banks, like the Bank of, like European Central Bank, Bank of England, and the U.S. Fed, that have been holding some of their foreign reserves, have frozen them. So that was like, oops, I guess we didn't anticipate that to the extent that we did. So they shored up their reserves compared to 2014, because then they realized that they were much more vulnerable, but perhaps they didn't anticipate such a big reaction from the West, at least up to now. If we keep buying, or if they are able to sell oil, it's not going to matter much. The ruble is probably going to stabilize if that happens. So I don't, if they're completely cut off, then for sure reserves are not going to be good enough to maintain ruble in any sensible way. Right now they're using this to prop up the value of the ruble to be able to buy anything from abroad, which is a lot of things. I think bigger problem for them is right now nobody wants to sell them anything. I was just reading a report that U.S. combines, very sophisticated combines, John Deere combines, were being shipped to Russia. Well, the shipper, K-Line, said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to drop them off in Belgium. We don't want to deal with Russia at all. So the problem is going to be, not immediately, but over the long run, how do you maintain some of these things? How do you maintain aircraft if you can't buy spare parts? I mean, if the sanctions persist, then no reserves are going to save you, and then reserves might not be as big of a problem if you can't buy anything in the international market anyhow.
I have a friend, a dear friend, who has a Russian wife, and she is from the area of Russia that adjoins Ukraine. So this might be influencing I suspect his view. But he sent me a note saying that we're not getting the whole story, that the other side isn't being told, i.e. the Russian side of things. And I'm wondering if you could comment about how the news is coming out, as you suspect, coming from a journalist, how you view the information we are getting from the sources that you look at, and whether or not that's an accurate picture of things.
I was a university student in the Soviet Union, so I think I've had an opportunity to live in that environment, which I think is very much part of at least Putin's thinking. I think there's a certain perspective, I think, that maybe we're not getting. NATO expansion, I think, is something that Russians fear. The idea of having missiles on their border. And I think that's something that probably isn't given enough credence. I like to look at the Russian news daily, and you do hear people bringing this up again and again. Would the United States, and Putin has said it in his speeches, would the United States react in the same way if they put missiles in Mexico? So there was back in the 80s, some of you who are older will remember this sort of thinking of, this logic of mutual assured destruction. This is something that kept things stable. This idea that we wouldn't make a nuclear strike because we knew they were armed enough to strike back at us and retaliate. So it kind of kept things stable. I guess a Russian perspective on this might be that, even the suggestion that Ukraine might be welcome to join NATO in the future is destabilizing.
Well, you want to say anything, or?
Well, I was going to say, sometimes Russia's pronouncements, they kind of echo Western, Western countries have intervened in other countries, often claiming human rights issues. And so Russia has been very critical, saying, well, West has done this before. They've intervened. You've helped separatist groups in other countries. And so So there's been those arguments, and so I think that is something to consider. I think there is a difference in most cases, but I think it is important to consider that.
Well, it is 1 o'clock, and we promised that we would get you out in time to go to your afternoon classes. I would like to thank my guests for this. I mean, getting a perspective on political issues and war from a political scientist and learning about other color revolutions and protests, fascinating. Realizing that actually in a liberal arts school, it's not only about politics or economics, I like to say that it's very important, but the importance of poetry and literature in understanding long divisions and finding out how suffering of people is going to be captured in literature and poetry after we long forget it. I mean, as I kept saying last week, markets by Friday forgot about this. It was on to something else. But poetry and literature is going to be able to capture this for a long time. So I'm glad that we are doing this from different perspectives, and I would like to thank my guests or all us for being here. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you for coming.